and welcome to part one of a lecture on the First British Empire. I want to start very quickly by just looking at this map, and you can see that the shaded orange colour on this map of the world represents the territories that Britain owned or controlled approximately in the year of 1763, around about this second part of the 18th century. So obviously we have Britain here, we have a small part of India. This will grow much more in the 19th century when Britain basically controls all of the Indian subcontinent. There are little islands over here next to the Philippines that are in British control. But to be honest, the East is not the main focus of what we call the First British Empire. It is the West that we are focused on, and in the West we have what is now modern day Canada. We have the 13 colonies, which would eventually become the United States, and then we have some little islands, Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica. These are the most significant British colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, and our focus today when we talk about the First British Empire is going to be on these western colonies. When in a future lesson we talk about the so-called Second British Empire of the 19th century, we will look at British control of India and even Britain's relationship with China. Okay, let's move on. What we're going to study across parts 1 and parts 2 of this lecture, we're going to study trade. That's the most important thing. The First British Empire is really an empire based on trade more than anything else. We will have to look at how these territories that Britain controls are governed and how they were defended by the British military. I guess one of the things to keep in mind as we study this topic is to think about the advantages and disadvantages of empire. There are many advantages, and they will more often than not be economic, but there will be some disadvantages that come with empire, such as war, and then there's this kind of potential moral dilemma of the type of empire that Britain finds herself in control of. Okay, let's ask and answer some basic questions just to get a sense of what we're talking about when we make reference to the First British Empire. When was it is fairly straightforward. It's the 17th century through until the early 19th century. Britain first sets up colonies in Virginia in the early 1600s, and eventually these will become 13 colonies of the British Empire that will then become the United States. Islands in the Caribbean come a little bit later, but still in the 1600s. For example, Barbados becomes a British territory in 1627. Where was this First British Empire? Well, historians nowadays use this term, the Atlantic world, quite frequently, and I think it's quite a useful phrase because it sums up exactly what we mean by the First British Empire. And the best way to look at this Atlantic world is through maps. And we'll start with this map here. First of all, here we can see Great Britain, here we can see the 13 colonies, this is Canada, and the West Indies is what we nowadays refer to as the Caribbean. Now, from the early 1600s, as the dates show, right through until the latter part of the 17th century and then into the 18th century, the Atlantic world really develops. And I want to focus on what we might call the 4 points of the Atlantic world. Point 1 is Europe. Our focus is obviously on Britain as point 1. Point 2 is the African coast, the west coast of Africa. Point 3 is the West Indies, the Caribbean. This is your British colonies of Barbados and Jamaica in particular. And then point 4, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, as well as the 13 colonies. Now this Atlantic world at these 4 points, as you can see from these arrows here, was connected, and it's a connected world in three different ways. We have definitely a flow of goods, so it's very much an economic relationship between Britain, west coast of Africa, Caribbean, North America, and these goods definitely flow back and forth. There is also a flow of people, and that in some respects from Great Britain are people who choose to go to the colonies or choose to go to the Caribbean to make money or start up new opportunities or for religious reasons. I'll come back to those points in a moment. Those leaving the west coast of Africa were not making their way across the Atlantic Ocean through choice. So there is a flow of people. I should say as well that those in the Americas, North America, sometimes go to Britain as well. A good example of this are escaped slaves who escaped the plantations, maybe in the Caribbean or the plantations in the southern colonies of the what would become the United States. And if they can make their way to Great Britain, then they are much more likely to be free from ever being recaptured. Okay, so Britain could be a place, a location where safety could be guaranteed. And the third thing that we have flowing back and forward are ideals. So there might be ideas about democracy, there might be ideas about religion, eventually anti-slavery ideas from Pennsylvania will make their way back to Britain. The American abolitionist Anthony Benezet influences the British abolitionist Granville Sharp with his anti-slavery views. So there's clear connections from these 4 points, right? Britain at point 1, you could say, is the most important of the 4 points of this Atlantic order because Britain really controls what is going on. Even though the west coast of Africa is not a British colony, Britain, through trade, controls much of what goes on here, although she does have competitors in the French and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese. But she can control the areas that she has an interest in, she can control her plantation economies in the Caribbean, and initially she can control her 13 colonies in North America. That doesn't necessarily work out so well. So we will look at the story in part 2 of this lecture, which will focus on the challenges of governing these 13 colonies. Just very quickly, you'll have heard of most of these places here: New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, etc. And you know that they all are geographically located down the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States. Your geography might not be so clear when it comes to the Caribbean, and that's for obvious reasons, right? It's very complicated with all these small islands. But here is Barbados, which would be a key British island, and here is the much bigger Jamaica. Jamaica becomes part of Britain in 1655. And these 2 islands will play a critical role in the British Empire, or the First British Empire. I don't really speak much about Canada, but the previous slide does make reference to the Hudson Bay Company of 1670, and the British here very much take advantage of the trade in fur in what is now modern day Canada. Okay, so we know when it was, we know kind of where it was. What was this First British Empire first and foremost? Well, it was an empire first and foremost for trade, and that's going to be most of our focus today. However, right, we should always bear in mind that there were other reasons, other factors as to why people would make their way from Britain to this new world. Here we can see in this image people who have no choice but to leave Britain, and that is because they are, for whatever reason, regarded as being antisocial elements within Britain. They are prisoners, they have been arrested, you can see them being chained together here, walking towards the port, most likely in London, to make their way to the New World. So you have prisoners, people are punished by being exiled. Now also the most famous stories regarding the British Empire are those who are sent to Botany Bay in Australia, where they will be imprisoned as forced labourers in that part of the New World. But before the Australian experiment of a large piece of land almost being a kind of penal colony, prisoners could be sent to the colonies in the Caribbean, but most likely in places like Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas because of the shortage of labour. So these individuals are not going to the colonies through choice. You also have religious reasons for migration to the New World, and the most famous example of this are the Pilgrim Fathers in 1620, who believe that their version of Protestantism is not necessarily accepted in Britain in the way that they would like it to be, so they start a new life for themselves and their followers in what is now kind of the Massachusetts area of the United States. So this is more of people moving for ideological reasons rather than for reasons of trade. And the final example are, I guess, people who were, it would be unfair to call them white slaves because they are guaranteed freedom, unlike African slaves who are not guaranteed freedom. Indentured servants or indentured servitude is common in the colonies, where young men would take up an opportunity to go to the colonies, may have a contract where they have to work for a master or a mistress for 6 or 7 years. At the end of that contract, however, they are guaranteed their freedom and quite often guaranteed some land, maybe given by the master himself. It would have been written into the contract at the beginning of the term of the servitude. So, for some, there may have been a sense of opportunity, even if that was delayed opportunity in the colonies. Anyway, I want to focus on the first of those factors, and that is trade. Right, trade is the main reason for the existence of the first British Empire, and the type of trade that we're going to talk about is unique to Britain in some respects. In the 18th century, we call this type of trade mercantilism, and this type of trade, mercantilism, again is linked to those 4 points that I mentioned a moment ago. Trade in Britain would be linked to west coast of Africa, the Caribbean, and the colonies. And the 3 other points, North America, Caribbean, and Africa, is where basically Britain would make money from. Right? This is where British merchants, British manufacturers, and the British government would ultimately make money from these other points of the Atlantic world. Right, what was mercantilism? Well, on my city you will read about mercantilism in detail, and there will be a little quiz later on for you to complete. But I guess we can look at this source. This is source 1. Some of the sources are embedded within this web presentation, some of the sources are in a separate Word document on my city, so you all have to go between both of them. But source 1 here, this little section or extract from the historian Simon Schama is really useful for giving you just a little idea as to what was meant by mercantilism, why it would be beneficial for the British to follow this type of economic trading system. So it says the British Empire was supposed to satisfy itself with just enough power and just enough central regulation from government to make the interlocking parts of its economic machinery work with well-oiled smoothness. Properly planted, that means plantations in the Caribbean and the 13 colonies, and protected from foreign despoilers and interlopers, so that would be the French and the Spanish pirates, the colonies would furnish raw materials, that might be tobacco, might be sugar, to the motherland, back to Britain, which in turn would send its manufacturers or manufactured goods back to the colonies. So a good deal for the manufacturers in Britain, they can sell the goods to a guaranteed market. Good for merchants who are bringing all of these raw materials back to Britain. Good for British consumers who get to consume some of these raw materials. With a buoyant home market, the suppliers across the sea would make enough money to afford the imports and would plough some of the proceeds into making their plantations even more productive. So the wealth of Britain would increase. This would lower costs, which in turn would make the goods more widely available to a bigger proportion of the population back in Britain. So the more, for example, tobacco produced, then the price of it could come down because it would not be a scarce item. The rising tide of reciprocal good fortune would lift all boats, and without the expense and distraction of vain conquest to protect, the empire of freedom and enterprise would knit the world together. So Shama is saying this was the kind of overarching idea that perhaps laid the very foundations for this British Empire. It's going to be a positive empire. It's going to be an empire of good or benevolence, as Simon Shama says. And you know, what can anybody really say bad about such an empire? What can people complain about in this instance? So that is mercantilism. Well, that's how mercantilism was meant to work. Britain would also have been the main beneficiaries of this system. The other 3 points of the Atlantic world would still do very well out of it, especially in the Caribbean and North America. But the main beneficiary had to be Britain. It was the British Empire after all. Now, the raw materials, if you like, that are sent back to Britain were, according to Simon Shama, habit forming. And therefore, what were these habits? Well, sugar is an obvious one. Sugar would make its way into British cakes. It would make its way into coffee. Coffee didn't actually come from this part of the world. Britain traded in coffee in the east. But coffee shops started to spring up all across London in the 18th century. And coffee being bitter, and other products like chocolate being bitter, needed sugar to make it much more palatable. And these coffee shops that you will read about in the My City chapter by the historian James Walvin, these coffee shops were a real hub, a real kind of bustling place to kind of spend time in London. And these coffee shops themselves relied upon sugar coming from the Caribbean to British shores. Sugar was also used in rum. Rum became a very popular drink, especially for British sailors. Tobacco, incredibly habit-forming substance, making its way from Virginia in particular to Glasgow more often than not, before it being sent to places like France and the Netherlands. And then maybe less important, rice, indigo and furs from what's now Canada. Now the question is, why were Britain able to dominate the world's trade in 2 things in particular, tobacco and sugar? These were the 2 most profitable raw materials. Well, Britain did face competition, mostly from France, right? France were a big competitor. The French had Caribbean islands in the same way that the British did. And Britain had to therefore use her naval power to ensure that she would maintain her position as the dominant force in the production and exploitation and consumption of tobacco and sugar. And what the British merchants and British plantation owners needed was not just naval protection, they also needed a government policy that encouraged this mercantilist system. I just want to very quickly read a short section from James Walvin. This is page 3 of Walvin's book, and the PDF for this section I'm going to read can be found on My City. The little bit I want to read just talks about the economic well-being of Britain being based upon points 1 and 2 that I've just read there, the Navy and government. So, Walvin says, the maritime fleet expanded beyond imagination. Ports and cities grew from simple villages to international trading centres. Banking and insurance boomed as never before. With so strong and profitable an economy, the nation developed its political and military muscles. Or, Walvin says, was it the other way around? Did Britain become an ascendant global power with this fantastic navy because of the strength it acquired from its colonial possessions? To some extent, it doesn't really matter what comes first. The fact is that Britain is the dominant economic force in the world, or at least in the European world, in the 18th century. And to go with this economy, she has the best, the most efficient navy in the world, or at least in the Western world at this point. So, with with this kind of trading system, with this economic system of mercantilism, comes the kind of requirement to have protection. So although Britain is primarily, the first British Empire is primarily a trading empire, power is also a part of it, and military power is also a part of it, and there is the desire to expand the empire, more power, more land, more territory, more economic opportunities. They do go hand in hand, trade and power. So let's move on to look at a case study, and this case study is based on sugar. And as I said in the Walvin chapter on my city, you can read more about the importance of sugar. Now, the two places that are of particular importance when it came to sugar production were on this map in your bottom right hand corner, Jamaica and Barbados. Barbados is pretty tiny compared to Jamaica. These islands had the perfect conditions for the production of sugar, and sugar production was rather labour intensive. So I'm going to click on, this is still source 1, but it's page 4 of Simon Schama. And Schama gives a really descriptive account of what was required for the production of sugar. And here he says, sugar cane needed, if it was going to be this perfectly produced product, right, just it had to be very carefully produced sugar so that it didn't go off. Sugar needed highly intensive, highly concentrated, task-specific applications of manpower. For the cane was an unforgiving and volatile crop. It could not be farmed and harvested in a single growing year, since it took at least 14 months to ripen, but once it had reached maturity, the cumbersome grass needed to be harvested quickly to prevent the sugar going starchy. Once stripped and cut, the cane in its turn had to be speedily taken to the ox-powered vertical crushing rollers. You'll see an example of this in the little video clip that you're going to watch in a moment, before the sucrose concentration of the juice self-degraded, right? So Schama gives us a kind of technical explanation. Now, who would basically be responsible for this labour? Well, all of it, and some of it was rather dangerous, all of this labour would be carried out not by indentured servants who were white, and definitely not by captive Native Americans. Native Americans knew the land, the terrain. They were actually quite difficult to capture in the first place because it was their island after all. These groups were deemed to be ill-equipped to provide this intensive labour. So, if you couldn't use Native Americans and you couldn't encourage white Europeans to do the work, then who would carry out the work in this incredibly hot, humid environment? Well, for a while, Portuguese and Dutch traders had been bringing Africans to the New World and using them as slaves. And Britain would not be far behind them. And Britain would realise that if you could bring slaves, this is point 2 of the Atlantic world, if you could bring Africans as slaves to the Caribbean, then you can solve your labour problem. And if you solve your labour problem, you can make lots of money. The British Empire, therefore, it's hard to say the British Empire had really any concern for moral factors at this point. What is important is trade, what is important is money and profit, and therefore the conditions that these Africans would experience in the Caribbean were quite far down the list of British priorities. In fact, very far down the list of British priorities. British plantation owners do very well out of sugar. So, if we look at one example, this individual here, James Drax, an Anglo-Dutch plantation owner, had done very well for himself, was part of this process that was, sending ships back to Britain with sugar. Drax made so much money from his sugar plantation that he had built himself a Jacobean manor house on the upland plateau of Barbados, and as we passed along the shore, the plantations appeared to us one above. You know, very grand, stately buildings, clearly worth a lot of money. Large acreage as well. These were luxury places for people to live. The sugar that's sent back is profitable, but sugar can be used in other ways, and rum was also produced on Drax's plantation, bringing in really significant incomes. So the British do well at all points. The British traders do well, the British plantation owners do well, and British consumers do well, incredibly well. All of these groups do as a result of sugar. Now, the benefits therefore can be seen, and again it tells us that this first British Empire really is a trading empire, right? It's not really getting concerned for much else. Now, this does lead the historian Simon Schama, who we've just been looking at, to ask a question. And the question he asks is, had Britain ended up with the wrong empire? Had Britain ended up with the wrong empire? He asks this question in page 1 that we looked at earlier on. And what Schama means by this is that first passage of Schama that I read to you, which refers to, you know, the benefits, the mutual benefits of mercantilism. There appears to be a problem with this system. In theory, it might work very well, but without slave labour, it doesn't appear that it's going to work. Because the Caribbean, the nature of the environment in the Caribbean, was not appealing to white workers in Europe to go there and produce sugar. So you had to force people to produce sugar. So the profits from the sugar trade could only be achieved if you take away the kind of mythological, idealistic version of mercantilism, and you put at the centre of mercantilism slave labour. What Schama means by the wrong empire is that Britain would eventually lose the North American colonies. We'll touch on this in the second part of this first British Empire lecture. Britain eventually loses the right empire, and she is left with this Caribbean empire. The reason why we might want to call it the wrong empire is when you watch this little video clip here of Jeremy Paxton. It's just a short section where you have to answer 10 questions on Jamaica and sugar production and slavery. When you watch this little clip, you'll see the appalling treatment of slaves in some of the plantations in Jamaica. And one of these plantation owners, Thomas Thistlewood, carries out real atrocious acts against his slaves, especially his female slaves, you'll hear about. So it does appear that Britain does have the wrong empire, that Britain never set out to have an empire that would allow such atrocities to take place. The way that the Caribbean was governed, right, there were approximately 23,000 white people in Barbados and 20,000 Africans in Barbados in the late 1700s. Because of the fear amongst whites, because they knew how poorly they were treating Africans, because of the fear that there may be some type of slave rebellion or uprising, then the view of white British, white Europeans was, well, you better treat these slaves severely, keep them in their place, because if you don't keep them in their place, then who knows how they might act. You know, do you want to wake up in the middle of the night to find a slave rebellion taking place and you being murdered in your bed? So mercantilism being about trade, the British Empire being about trade, it's all good and well, but it's a trade that requires real brutality, and that's what comes across really well in this Paxman clip. Okay, just a little summary of what we've just been speaking about there. Let's say that we do take this view of Schama, that the first British Empire was the wrong empire. Was it wrong for British consumers? Well, the historian James Walvin argues that British consumers do very well from this empire because the luxury items such as sugar and tobacco that make their way back to the motherland are consumed in great quantities, and the prices do come down over the course of time, with the exception of the period during the American Revolution when prices of tobacco shoot up due to scarcity of the product. But on the whole, consumers do very well. They like these things, they want more and more of these luxury goods. If you think about the contemporary world that we live in right now, and much of the clothing that we wear comes from places where we are educated enough to know that they're produced in sweatshop conditions, really poor conditions, dangerous conditions. If you look at what happens in Bangladesh, where we've had some serious fires, and the companies that use these sweatshops, whether it be Asda or Primark or whoever, are making lots of money and making lots of profit, and the prices of the goods that we consume are pretty low. So that tells us that, you know, for profit to be made on items that are so cheap for us to buy in the shops, tells us that wages must be pretty low. So we are aware of the poor conditions, we are aware of the poor or low wages, and we might have sympathy for the people working in these factories, of course we do, but do we really do that much about it? Can we even do anything about it? Because where do we then purchase our clothes? Because all of these companies are pretty much the same. It's hard to buy ethical clothing at an affordable price. So we should be of the view that, okay, consumers might have known that sugar was a product of slavery, but it's so far away, it's so distant, that it's not necessarily something that individuals will concern themselves too much with. Although, fast forward to the late 1700s, when the abolitionist movement picks up, and we will see a sugar boycott. We'll study this in more detail when we look at the slavery topic, which is the next topic. Was the empire wrong for merchants? Well, of course not, because they were making money. If there were slave traders, they were making money. If there were sugar traders, they were making money. If there were tobacco traders, they were making money, and lots of it. So merchants, they're okay with this. In fact, they are delighted with this system of mercantilism. Did the British government think that this was the wrong empire? Not necessarily. They had Caribbean territories, they had new territories, new territorial opportunities in India. So if you lose the 13 colonies, you just shift your focus from the west to the east. So the British government still makes money, still makes taxes from the empire, although the British government also has to foot the bill for having a large navy to ensure the protection of these territories, although I guess that eventually will fall on the taxpayer. Was empire good for plantation owners? Well, yes, and we just saw that in the example of James Drax. And many of these individuals became incredibly wealthy, but also incredibly powerful. And finally, was it good for British manufacturers? Of course, right? Manufacturers, artisans, people who worked in, let's say, the merchant city in Glasgow, they would put goods on their ships to make their way back to Virginia or Maryland or the Carolinas, and when these ships made their way to the colonies, then the ships would come back with tobacco that would be sold in Glasgow and then obviously on to other parts of Europe. So manufacturers were basically guaranteed that their goods could go on boats or ships that were making their way to the colonies. So I get what Shama means, we all know what Shama means, Shama himself knows what it means. This was not meant to be the empire that Britain had, but it was the empire that resulted in many, many benefits to the British population and to the British economy. There had never been a planned decision to base the empire in slavery, it's just the way things turned out. But because of the economic benefits, there wasn't really a desire, at least for 100 or so years, to question the use of slavery. What really drove the decisions of men at this point was the profit motive. Everything is about profit. In the next section, when we look at the American colonies and the loss of the American colonies, we can really start to see what Shama means by the wrong empire, because the American colonies were this great hope. This was going to be a land of freedom and a land of liberty. Something goes wrong in terms of how Britain governed the American colonies. So maybe the next section will turn our attention a little bit away from trade, and we'll focus on some other factors. The main factor being, how did Britain govern the territories that it controlled. So that will be part 2, which will be a separate video. Thank you.